some things in the course are more important for practice, some are more important for home ownership, general knowledge. Other things are more important, specifically you're going to get tested on it here. If I'm testing you on it here, it's because I think it's important for you to prepare for the state exam and maybe for practice as well. So I don't remember always what's on the final or whatever, but at least, if I can give you a reminder that, oh yeah, this is something to go back in and look at, that may be the only time you hear that from me, so you want to kind of pay attention to that. There's a lot of material covered in the course, and we can't test you on everything, literally, because some things, just are worthy of being retested on multiple times. So anyway, so here we go. All right, so the biggest challenge for anybody learning something new is to learn the language of that particular trade or that particular skill or that particular industry. Real estate is no different. There actually is, I suppose, one thing harder than learning the jargon, the lingo, the new language of that particular industry. And the language of real estate, by the way, happens to be sort of the language of the law. Some of the terms are Latin, or a lot of the terms that we used to use, were based on Latin terminology. Trying to get away from that, more plain English is good. But the harder thing than learning something new is taking the definition for a word you already know, a plain English word, and having to forget the way you think of it now and give it a new meaning. Cast off the old meaning and give it a new meaning. And there is some of that that comes up in this chapter, right? When you look at maybe the definition of land or of improvement or something like that, you may find that, oh, that means something different. Let me give you an example of how there are two different ways in which words or terminology can be used, even after you're in the business. How many of you in this class have ever, either you have yourself or you know somebody who has, gone to the bank or any other lender to get a mortgage? Raise your hand if you or anybody you know has ever gone to get a mortgage. All right, that's most of you. That's awesome, because you're probably all wrong. We don't get mortgages as borrowers, we actually give them. Now we'll cover this in chapter 15 and chapter 16 when we get to finance, and we talk about that. In practical language, if somebody comes up to you and says, yeah, I just went to the bank and got a mortgage, there's no sense in correcting them, because you know what they meant. They meant they got a mortgage-backed loan. But a mortgage isn't a loan. A mortgage is a promise to the lender that they can take the house away if you fail to make the payments. So the borrower gives the mortgage, the lender gets the mortgage. Now why am I even bringing this up? Well, because you've got two barriers to entry to get to where you want to get to. One is to pass this course, and one is to pass the state exam, and then you're at Valhalla or the Promised Land or whatever, you can then go out and make a living as a real estate agent. So technicalities matter. When the answer is either A, B, C, or D, it makes a difference if you understand the technical legal nature of what we're talking about. Right? So when we're looking at a word like improvement, what do you normally think of when you hear the word improvement? Right. To make better, to do something. But yeah, or to even if we do use the word improvement, we talk about land that's improved. We mean land that has utilities brought to it. It's already got gas and water and sewer and maybe electric and phone lines and cable. That's what we mean by There's a difference between a site which is ready to be built on and land which is ready to be farmed or is just sitting fallow or whatever. But in this chapter, they're specifically using the term improvement to say, yeah, something attached to the land. So that's something you're going to want to watch out for as we go through. New terminology is probably easier to learn than something you already have in your head that you're going to have to relearn, at least for the course. Once you get through the course, real estate agents don't sit around and use just the language that's in the book here. They speak like everybody else, and in my mind, they're always misspeaking because I teach this and I want to get everybody through it on a test question basis. But just for the course, keep in mind that you have to be proficient enough to get through the test, which is different than actually practicing and or being able to answer somebody's questions in the right technical manner when they come up. All right, so back to the order of things here. When you think of land, what comes to mind? Before reading anything, when somebody said land, what would pop into your head? What kind of image? Okay, the surface of the earth, probably a two-dimensional way of thinking, right? And that's normal. So the book points out we can't think about it two-dimensionally anymore. Land now is a three-dimensional concept. So we draw it like this because of this idea that the land goes down to the center of the earth. So it's kind of an inverted cone, if you will, or an inverted pyramid, maybe is more accurate, where, you know, the Romans had this idea, though the definition really is more generally attributed to English common law, the idea that your land went all the way out into infinity, and that basically you own air rights, and you own surface rights, and you own subsurface rights. So this idea has been around for a long time. Now, when we think about air rights today and being in perpetuity, or not in perpetuity, but being infinite, we know that's no longer the case, right? What impacts our air rights today that didn't affect, you know, the English 400 years ago or the Romans 2 millennia ago? The air flight, right? I mean, so once the FAA came into existence, or whatever its body is, you know, equal body in other countries, there's now regulation. That also happens in this course, where we talk in general theories about this is how it is, but that's oftentimes absent sort of, well, here's the regulation that then takes away some of those rights that we say you really have. So there'll be a little bit of that where you'll kind of have to build these ideas in your mind where we're teaching you certain concepts, but they may actually technically be slightly wrong. And that's just because if we try to get into all of the nuanced detail of every single legal concept we teach you, we have to have a 3-semester-hour course just for that idea. So I'll try and kind of point that out, but hopefully you're prepared for that, moving back a little bit between sort of the forest and the trees. So we know we have air rights here, and we know we have surface rights, and we know we have subsurface rights that go along with this definition of land. So that's a little bit different. Now really all we're doing here with these definitions of land and real estate and real property is helping you to see the sequence of how we get to what really matters. Because what really matters to us here ultimately is this real property definition. So how do we get from land to real estate? What's the thing we do? Yeah, we add some kind of an improvement. Now this improvement could be above grade, below grade, so if there's just a water main or sanitary sewer running below grade, that's an improvement. There could be a barn, there could be a house, there could be a street, anything. Whatever it is, anything that is attached to the land basically. Now we're talking about something more than just land. Now we're talking also about these improvements, so we define this now as real estate. So let's just put a house up here or whatever, and now I wanted to prove to you that I made it all the way through the 3rd grade, so I wanted you to notice my curly Q smoke thing there. So there's our improvement, right? So now we're talking about real estate. So what do we need to add from land to real estate to get to real property? What do we add between real estate and real property?
Rights.
Yeah, legal rights. This is super critical. This is what a fair amount of the course is going to be about. This will impact your practice. This matters to people in terms of what they can do with property, and this will encompass a fair amount of things that you get tested on both in the course and at the state exam. This is where the law part of everything sort of comes into play. Right? So when we add this bundle of legal rights, which used to be historically represented by a bundle of sticks, we would have this, that's a little bit farther. Okay, so we're going to add these various rights that are here. I'll come back to this in a minute. That's what gives us this whole sort of real property definition. I'll just put these up here so we can remember them. For whatever, you can memorize these in any acronym in any way you want. I find that the bundle of rights are easier to memorize if you want to memorize them by using that acronym of PUC. It's a different order. I don't think the order really matters. All right, so while we're talking about real property, let's kind of switch over here and talk a little bit about personal property. Because basically, for our purposes, there are 2 different types of property in the world: real and personal. So here's real property, which, by the way, that term can be shortened into realty. If you've ever wondered where that term comes from, realty is just a shortened version of real property. The other side of this property coin, because every bit of property is either real or personal. It all fits into one category or another. So then how do we separate the difference? How do we define what real property is versus what chattels are, or personal property, or as the book says, personality, which looks like a misspelling of personality. I used to have a personality question on my exam in my class, and students would constantly complain that they didn't pick the answer personality, which is the right answer, because they thought it was a misspelling of personality. So I quit that. Nobody uses the term personality in practice. You'll hear the word realty, of course. You've seen this probably. So what's the main differences between personal and real? How do you define it? I had a graduate real estate professor who was a lawyer, did nothing but real estate law, and he said this: real property is everything that isn't personal property, and personal property is everything that isn't real property. And I thought, that's dumb. That's like the lame-ass's definition anybody ever came up with in a classroom before. So for me, here's how I think of it. Real property is the planet and everything that's legally connected to it, which tends to mean physically connected, right? So at one point in time, what we had was a molten ball of realty sailing around the universe. And until there were organics and was life and other stuff came into play, everything here was all real property. So if you can kind of grasp that, then it does make a little more sense that everything that doesn't fit into that category maybe then could be personal property. Now, personal property, for whatever it's worth, just to point this out, for those of you who are interested in such things, also can be subdivided. You don't need to know this for this class, but it's either tangible, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about here, or it's intangible. Now, intangible personal property includes things like stock certificates. You may be able to touch the stock certificate, but it's not really a piece of the company. It includes intellectual works. IP is a bigger deal all the time, so software, books, poems, songs, music, it's all intangible personal property. Literally, almost everything is real or personal property. So tangible side of this would be things like a throw rug. Then the question is, well, I've got carpet in my house. Is it real property or is it personal property? That's part of what a real estate agent needs to know. When's the first time as a real estate agent you're likely to run into this issue? Or what's an example of when you really need to know personal property, real property? When are you going to see this in a transaction or in your career?
Refrigerator, stove.
Okay, so when you're talking with a client, either a buyer or a seller, what's the kind of thing that a buyer might ask you if you're taking them through a house? Yeah, what stays? Do the blinds stay? Are they leaving the refrigerator? The washer and dryer go with the house? What about the above ground pool in the backyard, the swing set, the pool table in the basement? There's all kinds of things. So here we're talking about the legal technical definition, so that if nothing is written in the contract, real property will transfer with the sale and personal property will not. But it isn't always working that way. There are times when personal property stays behind. And maybe it is the refrigerator or the washer and dryer. Maybe they're really personal property. We could have long arguments about these kinds of things. It doesn't really matter so long as it's clearly defined. Another thing that's happening now, this is kind of interesting when you're looking at property, some houses aren't even built on site, they're built in a factory. They're shipped out on a trailer. It's not even houses anymore. You can get mid-rise hotels and condo buildings and other things that are just assembled in modular precast concrete units that come out. When those modular units are sitting on the back of the truck, what are they? Real property or personal property? Personal, right? And as they get attached to the structure, what do they become? Real property. This is this process of severance and annexation or attachment that they talk about in the textbook, and it's an extremely common sort of thing. Now, when we have plants, again, I'm not going to test you on this. I'm sure that Kurt will be disappointed that we won't have, a farm crop kind of question, but it is important to understand this, and you can put this in fairly simple context. Around here, most of the crops are what? Personal or real property? Personal, because you plant them, they're seasonal. They're there and they're gone, and they're there and they're gone. So it's not at all uncommon for a developer or a builder to buy a working farm with crops in progress and decide, I'm not waiting until October or November or December to break ground. I want models up and available, and so we're breaking ground now here in June or July. Well, if you break ground in June or July and you tear up the farm, what's the farmer going to be entitled to? The value of the crops. And oftentimes today, at least post-sale in particular, the crops typically belong to somebody other than who now owns the land. So that's a common kind of thing if you deal in that space, to be able to clearly and very quickly say, oh, okay, there's crops on here, that's a separate piece of property from the land itself. How's that being handled? Well, basically whoever's farming it, whether it's a renting farmer or the owning farmer who's now going to be selling it and losing title to the property, the crops will probably still remain. So the developer's going to, or builder's going to tear it up. If it's $4 a bushel for corn and 250 bushels an acre, whatever, the farmer is entitled to that, even though he never has to go out and harvest it. The combine can be used on some other field that season or whatever, right? So this matters. Whereas you start to get away from here, you get to California, you get to Florida, you have orange groves, olive trees, other kinds of things. Those trees are typically considered part of the real property. They're not so easily severed. We don't cut them down every spring and replant them. Even around here, you do have fruit trees, plums, pears, apples, etc., right? Those that require frost for the sap to run in order for the fruit to come about. Those would be, treated differently, would be part of the real property instead. You could see a plants kind of question at the state exam. So back to these rights here we were sort of talking about. So we're talking about real property now. These aren't an exhaustive list, but for the most part, if you think about it, they define what you can do with real property. So possession, you've got the property, you can use it, basically, is what they're talking about. And we'll revisit these terms a couple more times in the class. I personally will not ask you a question, here's a scenario, which of the five which of the five rights. It doesn't really work that way. These aren't that clearly defined, and some would argue, well, what about the right to develop the property? Or so what about the right to this? This is just general common law concepts been around for a long time that say if you buy real property, these rights go along with ownership. So the right of possession, you can use it, do it what you want. The right to control it within the framework of the law. What would be an example of this? If I own the property, what can I do that's legal but really restricts what happens on my property?
Zoning laws?
Well, zoning would be a municipality thing, but you could further restrict it yourself. You could say, this is my house, my in-laws are never stepping foot on this property. Perfectly legal. Because you have that right, it's recognized as your right to control. So, in a broader example, what can you have? Just no trespassing, keep out, private property. My land, our land, stay off. Unless you pay us a fee, or you're going to buy a license to hunt here or do something else, our property, private, right? I mean, if you go up to the, if you buy a ticket for a afternoon ball game at Wrigley Field, and you decide to show up at 8 a.m. and just kind of hang around and decide you're going to go in, they may or may not let you in, right? That ticket is really good for a particular time. It's not good for whenever you want on that particular day. The right of enjoyment. This right of enjoyment is more than just, woohoo, I really like where I live. This right of enjoyment is more about, this is yours, and your rights supersede anybody else's right to that property. And we'll talk about this in terms of context of title, and in terms of how does that work for a tenant. Those things we'll look at later in the course. Right of exclusion goes back more to what I was talking about with keep out, but it's also right to control. When we talk about leasing, I'll ask you to revisit that idea of who has the right of exclusion, the landlord or the tenant. And then the right of disposition. Eventually, what do we all probably want to do with a piece of property? Sell it, probably, right? So all these are, inherent rights in real property, and that's really what matters to us here. This full ability to use property. Can these be limited or restricted? Daniel mentioned one already. Zoning would be a municipality's way of saying you can't do this or you can only do that with your property. So in the broad common law theory here, the idea is you've got this full range of rights. Just like in theory here, you've got air rights all the way past Mars and everything. But you have to come back and say, well, hang on, regulation there that also impacts me or limits me. All right, so to spend a little more time on this severance and attachment thing. So we understand that there is real property and there is personal property, that everything at one point in time was real, then stuff started growing, and then we started cutting it down, and then we started turning it into lumber and building houses. Right? So you can get a test question that relates to this kind of thing, so it's important to understand, but it also happens in practice. So as a real estate agent, your first blush with this probably will be when you sit down with a seller to talk to them about selling their house. I always ask the seller, what do you have that looks like real property that you're planning to take with you? And what do you have that looks like personal property that you're planning to leave behind? And in the listing agreement, you will specify, the listing agreement meaning the contract between you as the broker and the seller, that says here's what stays and here's what goes. And then you'll put that information, if you're putting it into a multiple listing service, you'll put that information in there, and that's then broadcast to any other real estate brokers who are looking at that from a buyer standpoint to know, they're planning on leaving these things, they're planning on taking these things. Because ultimately, the seller and the buyer need to be on the same page with what is happening in the transaction overall. Just because something is real estate doesn't mean it can't be removed. It's very common, very in a relative sort of sense, that there'll be some dining room chandelier in you're selling a house that's been maybe it's a farmhouse, been in the family for 5 years, or 5 generations rather. And the current generation doesn't want to farm, they don't need the house, whatever, and so they're selling the place, but they want to take the chandelier in the dining room, or some other thing. They can do that. What would be the best way for somebody who clearly wants to sever something, to cut something off the real estate and turn it into personal property? What would be the best way for them to handle it when it came, or you to help them to handle it when it comes to the sale? Should they put a sticky note on there that says this does not stay? What would you recommend?
Take it down.
Okay, take it down. Go ahead.
Take it down, or this happened to us. They took money in the mirrors and fixtures, and it wasn't mentioned in the contract it had, so it was pre-written, pre-discussed, so that you know
Right. What are you getting?
What are you getting?
Right.
Do you want that chandelier with your grandmother's, or
Right.
is that going? So otherwise you're gonna walk into a dark home.
Yeah, and it's all about managing expectations. You walk into a dark home and you're now pissed or annoyed or disappointed or something, depending upon, if you're me, you're pissed. If you're you, maybe you're just annoyed or disappointed. So yeah, taking it down would be the first step, but you should just replace it. Right? If you're gonna stage a house for sale, just get it ready for sale. Take out what you're not gonna leave. Go to Home Depot or Lowe's and buy whatever thing you're gonna put there in its place or whatever it is you're gonna do, and do it. So that's done. That way the buyer never sees it, never has expectations, et cetera. Yes?
Related to that scenario, if it wasn't discussed before the contract was signed, can it be assumed that they would have to replace it?
Well, so there's really where we are right now in this chapter, in this course. So if the contract is silent, and doesn't say anything about it, then we get into these 3 tests. What are the intention of people, et cetera. And this is where it really matters. Well, was it real property or was it personal property? Because if it was personal property, you could argue that the assumption is it was going to be gone. That's where you get into the real challenge with, say, window treatments. So let's think about window treatments for an example. What are window treatments? Personal property or real property?
Have to be specific.
Okay, have to be specific, like in what regard?
I'm going to take mine with me, so they're personal property.
Well, you want them to be personal property, but it doesn't really, whether you take them or not doesn't necessarily define what they are. It's good to define what's happening with it,
Okay.
but you're onto something here.
They're anchored.
Okay, so what kind of window treatments are anchored? Or what parts of window treatments are anchored? Right, like let's take drapes for example. So you've got whatever's attached to the wall. Now you've got a rod that maybe is attached and maybe is loose. And you've got the drapes themselves, which are just pieces of fabric that you can buy at Walmart. I argue if you can buy it at Walmart, it's not real property. But that's not necessarily true. So if you had single unit mini blinds that are screwed into the window head, that kind of sounds like real property to me. Yeah, but if you got drapes, maybe partially.
Maybe the rod stays.
Yeah, so although we're talking here about, God, oh my God, I gotta know which is it? Nah, not so much. What you gotta know is it's confusing. And that's your job to sort that out right at the very beginning.
So if you have like a basketball hoop that's weighed down by like a water base,
Yeah, that's,
instead of like cement,
Right.
where you can't get it out, so that'd be like pretty much the main difference.
yeah, exactly. So in the case of how is something attached, and I haven't quite gotten to that slide yet, but that's a difference, right? So you go to Walmart and you buy the big, base thing, whatever, and it's got a heavy base and it sits there and you can't move it by yourself, but one would think is the intention is to take it with you. Whereas if you drilled a 3-foot deep foundation, fill it with concrete, and it's there, it looks pretty permanent, one would think that the intent of the installer was to leave it behind. Now, somebody else might argue, yes, but 3 feet above that foundation, there are bolts, and I can detach that, and I can take the top post and the backboard and the hoop, or I can leave the post, but I can take the backboard and the hoop, or I can just take the net. That net was from when I was in high school, and we won the championship, and whatever. So, I mean, you get into all kinds of funny things. This is why you have to ask, and this is why you have to know enough about it to know, okay, I don't need to sit here and explain to my client, you can't take that hoop, damn it, that's real property. I learned that in my class. Immaterial. You just need to know, okay, I'm facilitating a transaction, I am managing expectations, and there are some things in every transaction that could go either way, and I need to help my client define them. I need to make sure that that gets communicated effectively to the other agent, and that agent needs to communicate that to their people. Now, when the potential buyer writes an offer, what are they free to ignore? Everything I've told them about what's being sold with that house, because you can offer to buy whatever you want to offer to buy, right? So you can put on there, the seller could say, we just spent $2,500, these are the best washer and dryer God has ever created, we're taking them with us. And the buyer's free to make an offer, including the washer and dryer. In which case, then the seller needs to work with their agent to figure out, okay, how are we going to counteroffer and how are we going to deal with that? But again, this is one of those important areas to sort out is, what is attached and what isn't. So here, the state wants you to kind of understand the legal technicality. I think it's a good idea as well. You should at least understand this is the genesis of everything we're talking about. But this can come at you in all sorts of odd forms. Quick example. So in a transaction that was all papered, ready to go, odd situation, I was representing the sellers. The buyers and the sellers met for some reason. Kind of hate when that happens. About a week before the closing. They, both young couple, they kind of hit it off at one point in time when we did a quick walkthrough or whatever, and they met completely independently of any agents at all. And during that meeting, my sellers explained to them that these wood frame stained glass hangings that probably were about 2 foot by 4 foot in panels, maybe 2 foot by 3 foot, that hung on eye hooks around the screened porch. Maybe it was like a three-season room that probably had storm windows, was something they had purchased from the seller when they bought the house. Now, they didn't make it clear that they bought them as a separate item, wrote a separate check, etc. So the buyer's assumption about their transaction instantly changed. The buyers instantly believe now that they should have the legal right to those wood frame stained glass hangings because somehow to them, in their mind, they were now belonging to the house. And since they were buying the house, they must get them. So in a rare case where I showed up at the closing about 5 minutes late, there was already an argument going on at the closing table. Not a heated argument, but an argument like we've kind of seen already here where clearly the expectations weren't well managed. And so I kind of got in the middle of it and just explained to the buyers, look, this is what happened. It was a separate transaction. It wasn't all the same transaction. They're not included here. It's very clear that they're, they just get lifted off the eye hooks. We're leaving the eye hooks, whatever. And then, without letting them speak at all, I turned to their agent and I said, is this really an issue? She said no, and the discussion was over. She never expected them to be there, the buyer's agent. But, so this came up even after the transaction. So anyway, it's just the kind of thing you need to be aware of. That happens and has to be dealt with. Managing expectations. So that's really a lot of what this is about. For the builders here, there are things we call fixtures, right? Light fixtures and bath fixtures and things. I mean, it comes back to this legal term. If we go to Lowe's and buy a new light fixture here for the ceiling, it's personal property, right? While it's in the box, while it's in the store, while it's in the back of the pickup, and it comes to the job, it still sits in the box. It's still a fixture. It's still a piece of personal property. Well, once it's attached and wired, it automatically converts, right? So that's this idea of attachment and severance. Anything can go from one to the other. It's just a way, using legal terminology, to describe the transformation. And when we look at these tests, it's not always attachment. A lot of what we're converting doesn't get attached. So think about the average house. It has a driveway, right? Is the driveway bolted down? I don't think so. It's just, the driveway comes, if it's concrete, or even asphalt, I guess. Asphalt's about 6% oil. Concrete's much more obviously liquid when you pour it. It comes, it's a truckload of liquid personal property. And then it gets poured in place and it's smoothed out in a little while. In a matter of hours it starts to congeal, harden, cure, and turn into something that everybody expects is going to stay. So attachment is one possibility, but more likely the idea is just, what's the intent? Does anybody really think they're going to win an argument in court that concrete driveway, it's not attached, Your Honor, I intended to take it, everybody should have known that. No way. So if you go down to the Stone Center and you buy a 5-ton boulder to landscape your front yard, and it gets dumped there and maybe placed with a tractor or a crane or whatever, it's not attached, but what do you think it's going to be considered? Real property, because nobody's going to throw that in the back of the moving truck when they head out of town. So there are cases when you can make assumptions, but it's always best just to ask. So method of attachment is one thing, right? That gets back to our window treatments. That's, the refrigerator is just rolled in place. The washer and dryer are really just set there. They're not really attached. They're connected with hoses and a vent and things. That's where it gets to be a little funky. And then this is probably the best one, this last one here, agreement between the parties. If the contract clearly specifies it, then there really shouldn't be any argument. That really, I just listed these, I think, in the order that they have them in the book, but in my mind, that's the best of these. You can buy personal property as part of your house purchase. A common, again, relatively speaking, sort of thing to stay is a pool table in the basement. I don't care how much, beer and pizza you give your friends. When they're done at the end of Sunday night or whatever, and they're exhausted, and they realize there's a 2,500-pound slate top pool table in the basement still to move, they're going to just all of a sudden have appointments they have to get to. And so it's not at all, it's happened to me a couple of times in my career where, one agent is calling the other agent at 9 o'clock on Sunday night and said, hey, your people want to buy the pool table in the house? If you're the buyer's agent, that's the listing agent's way of telling you that the sellers now have decided they don't want to move it, and your best response is to find out if your client will allow them to leave it, and they'll probably just give it to you for free. If the seller doesn't ask, say you got a pool table worth $2,500 in the basement, and you just decide at the last minute, you know what, we really don't need it, the place we're going turns out it's too small, we don't want to disassemble it, can you just leave it behind without the permission of the buyers or the buyer's agent? What do you think?
Yeah.
Worth
Yeah.
real money. I would argue you cannot. The parties bargained for something very specific, and now something has been changed, and it's unilateral, and the buyers haven't, assented to this. I guarantee you, if you allow that to happen, the buyers will come to you screaming, saying, "I'm allergic to pool tables," or something, and you'll have some terrible, messy situation. So you always have to check with that. And then number 2, I haven't touched on, this adaptation to real estate can hit things that you don't otherwise think of. So right now in this room, I want you to think, please, for a minute. What do you have that's small and portable and clearly at this moment not attached to the place you live or work, that you would probably, before tonight, have thought of as personal property, but really, because its sole purpose is to work in conjunction with real estate, is actually real property, or part of the real property? Small. Ladies would typically have this or them in their purse, gentlemen in their front pants pocket.
Cell phone?
Hmm?
Cell phone?
No.
Garage door opener.
Oh, well, the remote for a garage door opener is one, though you probably don't have one on you. You've got something that performs a similar function that you do have on you.
Keys.
Keys. Try selling your house without giving the buyer the keys. Get your own damn keys. These are personal property. I didn't sell you these. So, right, so this is an example of something that its sole purpose is to work with part of the real estate. So when you go to the closing, rather, it's a common disappointment for buyers when they only get one remote and there's 2 or 3 or whatever for the garage door opener. But you also want all the keys. You don't want to think that your sellers are, that the keys that they, gave to their friends and neighbors when they were watching the house or whomever are still all floating around out there, or that, you know, you're not gonna get any keys. I mean, you expect that. So that's an example. The best example I can give you is house keys of adaptation to the real estate. Now, any questions about that stuff regarding fixtures, attachment, severance, any of those kinds of things? Yes, Joe?
When I was building homes, I always recommended to my buyer, usually after closing, here are the keys.
Change the
Get
locks.
your own.
Yeah, I agree, no,
Get
that,
your own.
I agree completely. Yeah, change the locks, the cylinders, get them rekeyed, something, yeah. It's not really a lot of money, not in the context of a $300,000-400,000 house in particular. It's, you know, $50, $100 depending on who you hire. That's smart. I get into that with commercial property management stuff sometimes. I oftentimes hand the tenant keys and say, I have no idea who has these keys because I don't know if the previous tenant, you know, sold them all over town, so you might want to pay to have a locksmith come out. You know, and if they really whine about it, I'll do it, but usually we just suggest to them they do the same thing. And usually I don't even have keys, because once they do that, then I don't have keys to their space, except what's in a lockbox.
If the seller wants to take their fixtures and anything that includes the house, could the buyers demand a lower price because the fixtures do sometimes increase the?
Yeah, well, that's what you're looking at, right? So that's why, let's go back up a little bit. So one of the reasons why I suggest the seller just stage the house the way it's gonna be when the buyer buys it, so you avoid that problem entirely. And then you're gonna offer based on what you see. So if you were hoping the house was vintage 1925 and you realize it's a brand new $80 Home Depot light fixture, and, you know, yeah, maybe you offer less, maybe somebody else is gonna offer more. If you're going into a property and what you see is not what you get because there's sticky notes all over, this doesn't stay, we're gonna replace this, we're gonna replace that, I'm not sure the seller's doing themselves a lot of favors, because I would get confused. I wouldn't know what it was gonna look like. You know, so yeah, it's probably smarter to just deal with it in advance. But if you change something, once there's an agreement, now you're in breach of the contract, and the buyers could do all kinds of things, including walk away with no penalty. They could, you know, but yeah, you put the buyer in the driver's seat as a seller when you change the material facts of the contract by taking fixtures without having it prearranged or pre-understood. Am I answering your question okay? Yeah. There's no sort of established values that, oh, you took the dining room chandelier, you now owe me $212.47. It would be a negotiation that would happen, maybe even at the closing period. All right, getting away from the idea of fixtures, which may seem funny because we're using this term trade fixtures, I want to point out that there's a significant difference. In my mind, trade fixtures aren't fixtures at all, not based upon the conversation we just had. Of course, the conversation we just had was talking about the owners of the property, the seller, the buyer. Here, we're talking about something completely different. So let's talk about what's extremely common when it comes to rental property. Imagine the room we're in. This is about 1,000 square feet. It's enough space to run a small sub-shop, taqueria, something like that out of without any problem. Reconfigure it a little bit, and it's excellent size. When you go into a commercial building to rent a space like that, it's what we call a white envelope or a vanilla box. And it gets that term because basically you're going to have a plain white acoustic ceiling in it probably. Assuming the tile's there, you might just have white grid. You'll have prime white painted or finished white painted, either way, walls. Either a plain, simple vinyl tile or maybe just sealed concrete floor. And you'll have a half bath in a corner. And that's it. That's the vanilla box or plain white envelope. And so that's what you're going to lease. But you can't run your taqueria out of something like that. You might need a second bathroom. You might need counters and tables and chairs and a walk-in cooler or freezer and cooking equipment, etc. So now as the tenant, you're going to bring some of this stuff in, whatever the landlord doesn't provide for you, and some of these things are large and they're heavy and they're immovable, or they get bolted down, or if it's a pizza restaurant, you're going to have this enormous hood that's going to go through or any restaurant maybe, that's going to go up through the structure, and maybe the structural steel even has to be modified. All of these things are intended really to remain the property of the tenant. But the landlord has the right to get the property back at the end of the lease in the same condition that you took it in. These are common law rights. All of that can be modified in the lease. All of this is a very long way of saying just because it's bolted down or can't be moved, easily, like a walk-in freezer or something like that, doesn't mean it doesn't still belong to the tenant. So long as the lease is valid, and if the agreement doesn't say differently, those items that are there for the purpose of the tenant conducting their business remain the property of the tenant. So the difference here between a fixture and a trade fixture is that once you're talking about conducting commerce and trade on a site, and you're talking about a business entity or individual who's renting that property, they probably have a common law right to attach things, put things in there that under the previous few slides definitions and conversations we had would be considered fixtures, but here they don't attach or annex, they remain the property of the tenant. The tenant defaults, by agreement between the tenant and the landlord, stuff might remain, but landlords don't usually want to inherit tenants' fixtures because then they have to pay to tear them out.
What about people who work at home and they could argue like, oh, I use all these to, conduct my business
No,
on the internet,
I would think you would want to deal with that in a different way. Trade fixtures really apply where you're renting from somebody else. So a trade fixture in that case would have to apply more where somebody's got a bunch of stuff, say they got a server rack in their dining room because they're running, a website hosting out of the house they're renting from somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Then they would argue that, yeah, that stuff's attached and screwed to the wall, but you would also expect the walls to get patched when you went back into a dining room. That would be the only sort of housing example I could give that would connect. Because here we're really talking about renting a space in a building that somebody else owns and having the stuff still be the property of the tenant.
Okay.
A lot of times when you rent stuff, you take spaces as is, and so this doesn't always even apply. But again, it's there and something you could see a test question about along the way. So any questions at all about trade fixture stuff or whatever? All right, so the textbook here toward the end of the chapter talks about some characteristics of real estate. This just helps put some perspective on what we're doing. And now I'm going to run you through an example. We'll use my awesome drawing here and build on that to do some more stuff. So two basic types of characteristics here, economic and physical. Real estate, real property, it's scarce. There's a limited supply. Out here, where we have lots of farmland that can be converted into subdivisions, we don't tend to recognize that so readily. In Chicago, when we wanted to build a third airport, the debate was should we put it in Rockford or Gary or where at. We ended up buying land in Peatone that may or may not ever get developed. When they wanted to build a third airport in Tokyo, where did they put it? In the ocean. The amount of money they'll spend to maintain that artificial peninsula on which they built their airport is probably mind-boggling for us. But when you live in Japan or maybe Holland, you begin to see that land really is scarce. It's very, very limited. Right? So that has an impact on value. Something is scarce. If it's rare, it's harder to replace. So scarcity is an economic characteristic of real estate. Improvements, we talked about this a little bit. Let's talk about it a little more. That something has an improvement on it, does that necessarily make the value higher or lower, or does it matter? Let's think about an example here, right? So let's go back to our land at one point in time. Let's say this is 1850, and they got this land here in the Illinois Territory, and they come out and it's all either prairie or woods or whatever. And then they decide to build what still exists in many of these areas, an enormous barn. Tremendous improvement, right? To the land, if you're going to farm, these barns are these huge 6-inch, 8-inch oak timbers, and these things, well, if the roof stays on, it's maintained, they'll last for hundreds of years. So clearly that's an improvement, and it did what with the value when they first constructed it? Drove it up significantly. Now fast forward 150, 170 years, and that same barn wasn't so well maintained, and it's largely half collapsed, and it's laying there, and you wouldn't want your kids or grandkids to go near it, be afraid that it would collapse on them and they would get injured. Still an improvement or not? Yeah, it's still an improvement because it's artificially attached to the land, but does it drive the value up or down now? Down, because if Jeff wants to build a couple of houses on that 3-acre site, what's the first thing he's going to have to pay somebody to do? Haul that thing away, right? So this is the same thing that's true with teardowns. The house itself is always going to be considered an improvement, but if I go into a community, let's say downtown Naperville, for example, if you go into downtown Naperville, where there's still maybe some old 2-bedroom, 2-bath bungalows or whatever around there, maybe I could buy that place for $350,000, but where's all the value? It's in the land, it's in the site, it's in the location. So if it's gonna cost me 10 grand in permits and demo costs or whatever to remove it, once I pull it out, actually now the property's worth more, because if I sell it to somebody else, they're not gonna have to tear it down. So improvements can both increase and decrease value. In fact, and a single improvement can have a varying impact economically on the property it's on versus on the neighboring property. So imagine, again out here, that, we've got a subdivision that backs up to Kurt's farm. And we have the benefit of having a house that sits right on the back end of the subdivision, and all year long, we get to look out at this great open expanse. Twice a year, I have to smell Kurt's fertilizer or whatever he's got going on for the crops and things, but other than that, got this gorgeous open view. Kurt wises up after he comes here and learns cool stuff from me and says, screw farming, I'm gonna sell this and let somebody develop an industrial center here on my property. That improvement, that industrial development on that land does what with that land value? For that farmland, it's gonna drive it up significantly in value. But what does it do to the value of my house? Drives it down significantly. Same improvement, he's happy and living in Havana now or whatever, where he's gone with the thing, or he's farming 100 miles farther southwest, which is something a lot of farmers have done, by the way. Sell the old family farms up near the suburbs and buy farms literally 100, 150 miles downstate or elsewhere and do what they know, which is farming, but do it where they could buy the land for $6,000 an acre after they've sold the land up here for 25, 30, 40,000 an acre. So again, this improvement just kind of important to understand in terms of how real estate works overall, that a particular improvement can mean one thing for one person and something else for somebody else. Cool thing about real estate is this idea of permanence of investment. We just came through hopefully the worst real estate crash any of us are going to see in our lives. And it's not true everywhere out here, but in many places, what have happened with values since 2007? They went way down and they have since come back. This is a little different than if you invested in Enron in 2002, for example. It's gone. So real estate tends to maintain its value. If you don't need the cash, if you don't have to refinance when values plummet, you can just sort of ride it out and you still get the same functional use. You're still getting tenant rental income, or you're still getting the opportunity to live there or conduct your business there. So this is this permanence of investment thing. Plus there's just something cool about bricks and mortar, as they say. You can see it, you can touch it, it's there. As opposed to investing your retirement money in a 401k with mutual funds invested by somebody who you don't really even know where it goes. What's the three most important words about real estate? Location, location, location. Well, here it is, the predominant economic characteristic. So what is so unusual or unique? Why is location by far the single most important economic factor regarding real estate? What is it you cannot do with land?
Move it.
Yeah, you can't move it. It is where it is. So it's proximity to transportation, to water, to jobs, to climate, whatever. It is where it is. So that's why location is so critical, because it's one thing that we really can't move. You can sever the house, right, and truck it down the road, but the land itself is where? Same place. It is where it is. Right? Physical characteristics. The first two here really relate to land. Land itself, it can't be moved. We'll go through an exercise here in a minute that kind of points this out. So the land itself is immobile, and land itself is indestructible. What are you going to do with it? It's already dirt. You can incinerate it, I guess, then it'll just be ash, and you'll mix it in with more dirt. So land itself is immobile, and it's indestructible. All property is considered unique under the law. You can go into a 350 townhome subdivision where they all look the same to you, and the law considers each and every single one of those completely unique, even if 20 of them have the exact same builder packages. And even if of those 20, 8 of them have the exact same view out the back of the Jewel Osco or whatever happens to be there. In other words, it's never an excuse for a seller to be able to say to a buyer in the middle of their transaction while they're under contract and waiting to close, yeah, we've changed our minds, and don't worry, you can find some, you can just forget about suing us because there's 12 more just like ours, you can just go buy one of those instead. That would never be an allowable remedy. The law says, no, they bought what they bought. There's something about it that's unique. something is different. Slightly different location, slightly different view, slightly different airflow, something about it is different. And therefore, we consider every single piece of property to be unique. Questions about any of that sort of thing? All right, let's look a little bit here at just some legal stuff, and then we're going to go back and we're going to talk about some of these concepts, and I want to run you through a real-life scenario from our area so you can get a sense on a large scale that hopefully you'll be able to translate into your own life as a real estate investor or real estate agent about what you might be able to do with a piece of property. So this is the kind of law we're going to talk about. Chapter 11, I think we'll talk a lot about real estate contract law, but we're already touching on it tonight when we talked about, you know, rights of a buyer to walk or that kind of thing. So contract law is very fundamental to what we do. The more you can learn about contracts, the better off you are. Whether you're in construction or real estate or any combination of the two, those are contract-driven industries. So the better you understand contract law, the better off you are, particularly Illinois contract law. We're starting tonight talking about general property law, right? We're talking a little bit about some of these principles and precepts, but there'll be more of that in the class. In the next class we get together, we're going to jump right into agency. Agency in real estate might be a little bit different than what you might have learned if you've taken, for example, a business law class or a legal environment of business class. But agency law for real estate licensees, it's statutory, state by state, and it pays to know that, and there'll be a fair amount of questions on that. And we'll actually cover some of those things twice, at least the textbook does. Chapter 4, which comes up in our next class meeting, but also Chapter 14, which is about the license law, which is what we have to talk about, incorporates a lot of, it makes statutory a lot of agency things that might have been common law at one point in time. There are more federal regs today regarding real estate than there have been in the past because of this last economic downturn. So one of the things I have to adapt in this specific course meeting, for example, is there are new rules about closing statements and lender responsibilities towards residential borrowers that haven't started yet. Rules have been in place for about a year and a half. They don't take effect now until October 1st. So I've got to go back and study them, review them, change my notes, that sort of thing. Because once you get out to take your exam or practice, you're going to be living in a different world than I've had to, because those rules weren't the way they are now, or about to become. So there's more federal regulation, though most regulation really tends to be local for real estate, state or local. All different other kinds of tax laws of various sorts. Zoning and land use, which we'll talk about in Chapter 20, that really are ways in which the municipalities, for the most part, can restrict what you do with property, but it's all county and municipal level here. And then environmental stuff, which is constantly changing and drives a lot of things, good and bad. Usually environmental isn't too big a problem for housing, but for developers it can be. But particularly in commercial and industrial property, environmental issues can be a really, really big deal. So this gives you a sense of the kind of the breadth of law that touches on this industry. There are people who argue that real estate isn't a discipline. That real estate itself is kind of a mix of disciplines, a little law, a little accounting, a little finance, a little property, but it all comes together to create this discipline. It's just kind of an interdisciplinary mix, really, to be able to do what we do. These are the various sources of law in life for us in general. All law in the U.S., of course, flows from the Constitution. Congress then, on a federal level, works and passes statutes. And we typically have not had a lot of that, but there are more things now affecting us, and we'll talk about some of these in the course. Regulatory agencies, here this is mostly, again, at the state level for Illinois, for what we're going to talk about in terms of regulatory agencies, though we will touch on some federal regulatory agencies such as HUD, and that sort of thing. We have state constitution. We're on state constitution number 3 in Illinois. This one now is 45 years old. And obviously that's the basis for our state law, state statutes, including things like the Real Estate License Act of 2000, local ordinances, which are going to be things like zoning, building codes, etc. We'll talk about those a little bit. And then common law, or case law. And common law, it's a good idea to understand in general what we're talking about. If you go back in English history to about the 15th or 16th century, all laws in England were pretty much based on the king and the nobility and maybe the merchant class. There were no laws for, like, between regular folks. And so one of the court systems there that developed was basically a court of the common law for common individuals to be able to transact things. And the Parliament didn't pass laws, the courts just made decisions, and those decisions established precedents. And then other courts would then tend to follow those precedents. So common law tends to be case law, and there's a fair amount of this still in the United States. If it's statutory, then common law no longer applies. But we still have a lot of this common law stuff left over basically from English history and then modified throughout, various things in the United States. But that's also an important source of law that affects us. Questions about any of that stuff before I run you through this one example before we take a break? All right, so let me flip the lights on here so you can make sure you can see the board really well. Should have said so you can see me really well, but that's fine. So here we have now our land, right? We've got our, just to clarify this, we've got our land here, and then we have our real estate with the blue attachment here. We have that definition as well. And then we have our real property with the bundle of rights. Now let's imagine that this specific piece of property is not too far from here. And again, this improvement was built maybe in the 19th century or whatever. And as time changes, what you want to do with a piece of property to get the most value out of it will also change. That makes sense, right? Technology and the way we live and what's going on around us. So as I mentioned, we could possibly just completely sever this improvement, right? We could just can jack it up and back a truck and trailer underneath it and haul that house down the road, or we can tear it down, salvage the materials, whatever we want to do. If we're the owners, that's our right to do any of that we want to do. So let's assume that we're getting rid of this house, the barn, whatever the improvements are at some point in time, and we're deciding to use the property in some other way. So we're done farming it, living on it, whatever. Now what we've decided to do, well, I'm a boy, so what do boys like to do in dirt? Dig, right? So we're going to just dig a big hole. Now maybe what's happening here is that we're not just digging a hole for the sake of digging a hole, but we're mining what's here. And we keep excavating farther and farther and farther in the ground. What kind of stuff is around here that's worth mining? Gravel, sandy gravel, yeah. So you can dig a hole in the ground. If you're in the right spot, if you're near where a river was, for example, and so I'll give you a hint, this is near the DuPage River, the site that I'm referencing here. Over time, as the river meanders, it will deposit sand and gravel and other kinds of stuff that it washes down, and you can get this nice material called bank run material, or you can get, look at large deposits. So you excavate this and you can sell it to people who make ready-mix concrete or who are building buildings or who are doing landscaping or whatever. It's a different way to make money from land, right, is to literally dig a hole in it. Now, as I excavate this and go deeper and deeper and deeper and sever this real property, right? I mean, it's all real property until I start slamming the bucket of the equipment in it and dumping it in a truck, and then it becomes personal property. I truck it all down the road. Am I moving the land? No, because the land is still the boundaries of the property in the same place. As I do this over time, I'm, by using this terminology, until I get so deep I really can't cost effectively do it anymore, I've basically created more air rights, right? I now have less subsurface rights and more air rights. I'm just converting the property from one type to another. I'm not moving it and I'm not destroying it. Even though the dirt or the sand, the gravel or whatever is now gone. Eventually these pits get so deep that you either run into big seams of clay or other material that aren't worth anything, or you just can't function. They're just too far down, and either you're afraid that sidewalls are going to collapse, or the sides are too steep and it's too small and you can't maneuver, or the market changes, or a combination of this, and you're better off doing something different. So if you own a big hole in the ground and you've made money by excavating this material and selling it off, what can you do now?
Turn into a quarry?
Well, that is kind of a quarry,
like
but
a swimming pool?
yeah, well, you could do that. That's what the Centennial Beach is in downtown Naperville. It's part old quarry, certainly kind of next to some quarries where they used to teach scuba diving and things. That's one thing. Another thing you can do is fill it back up again. Other people have clean fill material. It might be clay, it might be sand, it might be brick bat. Brick will compact chunks of concrete without the rebar in it. You can over time charge people to use this as a landfill. And if you don't put organic material in it, nothing that's gonna decompose, no rotting, no lumber, no rotting leaves, none of that kind of thing, you can run machines on here that will compact it. It won't compact as well as the natural soil is, but you can compact it. So now we're gonna, over a period of 20 years or whatever, we're gonna fill this back up. For whatever reason, we couldn't make enough money before, so we kind of eventually filled this up. And we made money that way. And we still have the same piece of property basically, right? Same location.
Now you can build another house.
Well, you could. Now, there's lots of possibilities. One is things have changed enough. What was a rural location may now be suburban, and we can build houses on it. If you're really fortunate about this location, this is not drawn to scale. This is a large piece of property. Maybe running through the middle of it here, you've got, I don't know, a 4-lane interstate highway. So here's traffic in one direction, here's traffic in the other, here's your median there, and you got a lot more land than what I'm showing you here. And if you happen to have an interstate highway running through your large tract of land, what would drive the value of that land up even more than just having the highway? Well, billboards would give you some rental income, but really, what's the big thing with a highway? An interchange, an exit, exactly. So, if you're well connected politically, you go to your representatives and you get them to go to the state and say, hey, could you go to the Toll Highway Authority and convince them to build an interchange in the middle of our land? Maybe you make some political contributions or whatever. So this property that I'm talking about here and describing is at I-88, and the last interchange that I know of that was completely built that wasn't there, Winfield Road. So for those of you who don't know or aren't from the area or don't remember, what's at I-88 and Winfield Road, what is the name of the development that's there? Cantera, very good. Movie theater, it's got like 800 movie theaters in it or whatever. No, it's a 30-seat theater. You've got office buildings, you've got apartments, you've got some restaurants. That was all a gravel pit. For as long as I can remember, I grew up in Naperville. Long before that, it was a gravel pit. Sometime before that, it was probably a farm or a prairie or whatever. So Elmhurst Chicago Stone, the company that was in the business of selling ready-mix concrete and selling sand and gravel and whatever, and they had a concrete batch plant here. They would import cement and mix all those things together to make concrete. Elmhurst Chicago Stone couldn't make as much money on the sand and gravel pit anymore, so they decided to get into the real estate development business. First as a landfill, and they partnered with a company called LaSalle Partners, which is part of Jones Lang LaSalle, which is one of the world's largest real estate management, brokerage, and development firms based downtown Chicago. And they together developed that land. Huge. It's a huge deal there. It's the same piece of property. It hasn't gone anywhere. All that's happened is time has gone on. Now, I know you didn't come to class to try and figure out how can I make money by digging a hole in the ground. But this is just one example of creative thinking, of understanding the possibilities, thinking entrepreneurially, recognizing that this was probably done over an 80 or 100-year time horizon. And it's not like they got out of the sand and gravel business. They still have their pit out in Caneville and wherever else, but this is in the heart of DuPage County. This is right on 88. The land use changed and they recognized it, or maybe somebody else recognized it and made some suggestions to it. Elmhurst Chicago Stone also owned 2 quarries at Route 83 and where the northwestern tracks cross over right around St. Charles Road. One of them they still own and operate. The other one got to be too deep, and they sold it while it was still a hole in the ground. This was in the 1980s, I think. So in the late 1980s, they sold this thing for millions of dollars. Who pays millions of dollars for a hole in the ground? DuPage County. Why would DuPage County, I think it was $10 million at the time. It would probably be $30 million in today's, adjusted for inflation. So let's imagine that it's today instead of 1988 or whenever they did this. Why would DuPage County today pay $30 million of the taxpayers' money to buy a hole in the ground? And hint, the answer is not because these people were politically connected, which they were.
Location.
Exactly. Stormwater management. When the rain falls, it hits the roof of your house or condo building or your car or the parking lot, and it washes dirt down into the storm sewer system. And today's regulations are such that every drop of water that comes out of the air is gonna get treated and filtered before it goes back into the lakes, rivers, and streams, if it touches all of our hard surface. And we've got hard pan surface everywhere, parking lots, streets, sidewalks, rooftops. So the idea is that when it rains, if you send all the water to the waste treatment facility all at once, it can't handle it. And waste treatment facilities are located on rivers. You're familiar with Fox Metro's plant, it's on 31, right, just south of Aurora at the edge of Montgomery. Why is it there? Because there's a river there. So they can dump the now clean sewage into the river as water, so the people in Oswego can drink it. It's true. What I flush, you drink if I'm upset. That's how it works. That's why this whole treatment process is a big deal. So when there's too much water all at once, and as we continue to develop our real estate, what's happening, we have more and more and more hard surface. We have to hold it. So this idea of a retention pond or a detention basin or something like this is a holding place for water until the treatment plant can process all that water that's backed up. How many of you are aware of this idea that there are dozens, maybe it's hundreds of miles of 33-foot diameter tunnels about 500 feet underground, all around Undercook County? Yeah, the Deep Tunnel Project. It spent billions over time. The projects were so sophisticated, they were largely built by international contractors teaming with American contractors because the tunneling technology was far advanced in Europe ahead of what we had done here. And they went in and they bored these tunnels $100, $200 million at a time, all for the purpose, again, of having a place to store that water until the treatment plants could handle it before it could be dumped in the rivers and in the lake. So stormwater management is a big deal. So if you're talking to a builder who wants to build on a farm, you might find that they were frustrated because it's an 80-acre farm, and if they could build 4 houses an acre, they could build the houses they need, but they got to set aside land for schools and for retention, and so that's part of what we're doing now. It's more complicated to develop because we've learned lessons and realized that, oh yeah, we have to manage this a little bit better. So anyway, some basic lessons about what you can and can't do with land, some of the challenges that we face. Questions or comments about this at all? Fun stuff, I hope. All right, so when we come back from our break, we'll jump into chapter 3. We'll be changing gears a little bit there. I promise this is the last time I'm going to do anything fun for the entire course, so I'll be all dull now. So let's come back at 5 till. It's just shy of 15 minutes. At 5 till, we'll jump into chapter 3. And if you have questions, I'll be up here. I'm happy to talk to you. Sir. Oh, excellent.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. Oh, this is awesome.
The reason I signed up for the, I wanted to do the face
Oh, yeah.
stuff, but I may have